The invasion of the New Hampshire territory and the subsequent annexation into the Commonwealth was completed by late April 2295. Although the invasion had some problems at the start, the overwhelming military presence of the Minutemen had crushed the raider gangs in the area and pushed aside the feeble defenses of the local militiamen. The response in the Commonwealth was almost universally positive. In less than 2 months, the Commonwealth had quadrupled in size. President Hancock now enjoyed the highest approval rating of his entire tenure. With elections a little over a year away, he was almost guaranteed a third term in office. But soon problems would arise that had no easy solution, and the Commonwealth would be mired in long-term conflict. In this final episode, we will see the long aftermath of the New Hampshire invasion, collectively known as the Conflict, when the Minutemen would face off against the original inhabitants of the New Hampshire region and the new colonists that arrived in the area. Some historians place the decision to enter New Hampshire as far back as 2292. Advisors to President Hancock warned that the Commonwealth region was beginning to get overcrowded, and that civil disturbances could arise from this. In the first few years, colonists from Massachusetts, New York, and Delaware arrived, but soon colonists from states that were further away began to arrive as well. The new territory of Far Harbor was fully colonized in less than a year, and more land was needed to accommodate all the new Commonwealth citizens. The territory of New Hampshire was the obvious solution to the problem. The addition of New Hampshire and Vermont could quadruple the area size of the Commonwealth. The additional agricultural and timberlands would ensure that the Commonwealth would be able to cover its basic needs and would provide the springboard to expand further west. The repeated raider attacks from New Hampshire provided the perfect excuse to enter the region. While the Minutemen planned the invasion of New Hampshire, the government was already working on a post-invasion future. President Hancock met with the land speculators to plan out where settlers would move to. Lucrative contracts were written up and were just waiting for the conquest of New Hampshire to finish. Land speculators were already carving up large sections of the state to sell or to rent to colonists looking for a home. The Commonwealth Reconstruction Corps was already hard at work restoring the rail line from Boston to Manchester. Meanwhile, the natives of New Hampshire could only look on helplessly. In the Commonwealth, large wagon trains of settlers headed north towards the promise of cheap land and a prosperous future. Newly arrived immigrants from Tennessee and Indiana in particular made up a flood of people settling in the new territory. Joshua Chase, formerly of the Manchester Militia and now a captain in the Minutemen, was quite pleased of how things had turned out. He had given the Minutemen access to New Hampshire and in return had been appointed governor of the new territory, the second most powerful person in New Hampshire, next to Colonel Hollis. He knew that every new colonist in New Hampshire made him that much more powerful within the Commonwealth. Now he just had to put down the rebellion that was forming. The invasion of 2295 was worse than any of the Green Mountain militia leaders had feared. Elijah Allen was stunned that Joshua Chase had betrayed them. Leonard Webster's Concord Crusaders had been crushed in open battle. Only Matt Vandenberg was not surprised. He had predicted what the Minutemen invasion would mean for the New Hampshire region. He had also been the only one not to engage the Minutemen in a pitched battle. Vandenberg knew that the GMM did not possess the raw firepower to oppose the Minutemen in open battle. He chose instead to retreat to the mountains and forests of Vermont and wage a clandestine war. It had been his attacks that had thus far stung the Minutemen the most. The three leaders met in late April of 2295 to decide what to do. All three had different perspectives on the situation. Webster's forces had been crushed at Manchester, but he had been scouring the countryside recruiting farmers to join his crusaders. He focused on gathering militiamen and supplies. Once he had a sufficient strength, he would avenge all the militiamen that he had lost in Manchester. Elijah Allen had also fought the Minutemen around Rutland, but withdrew his forces when it became clear that he was overmatched. His Rutland militia now harassed the Minutemen patrols in southern Vermont, and could not see any way that the GMM could expel the Commonwealth. Matt Vandenberg's ancestors had all been survivalists. Their greatest fear had been the government coming to arrest or kill them. They planned for this by stocking up on a series of guerrilla warfare books and manuals. Vandenberg now turned to his family library to plan out a long-term campaign to drive out the Minutemen. Once again, a vote was held to elect an overall leader, and once again, the leaders failed to elect an overall commander to coordinate their efforts. The militias would operate their own areas and would engage the Minutemen in their own way. The May 5th bombing of a Minutemen barracks and a series of ambushes in the New Hampshire area came as a rude shock to the people of the Commonwealth. Although most people in the Commonwealth favored a tough response to these attacks, a small but growing minority began to openly question the Commonwealth's expansionist policies. The Continental faction in Congress still held sway, but Hancock's critics once again had reason to question his judgment. In an interview, he was quoted as saying, "This was just a little war, and should be soon resolved." Hancock pressed Hollis to get the attacks under control and to integrate New Hampshire into the Commonwealth at whatever cost necessary. Colonel Hollis declared martial law on the territory, suspending civil liberties until the situation came under control. He then cancelled all plans to return to the Commonwealth. The 11th Minutemen Reserve Company had been hit the hardest by the explosion. They were withdrawn and replaced by the equally inexperienced 8th Minutemen Company. He then instituted a series of aggressive patrols along the roads, requiring all residents of the territory to carry identity papers to travel back and forth. In the next few months, he sent entire companies out to the countryside to try and engage enemy forces, only to find nothing. Yet whenever squad-sized units ventured too far from their bases, they would inevitably get hit. It became clear that the militiamen were more active deep in the countryside, away from cities and further away from the Commonwealth border. A series of zones were identified. The green zone closest to the Commonwealth border and around cities was safe. The yellow zone in the southern New Hampshire region had a chance to be dangerous. The orange zone in the middle of the territory meant that caution had to be exercised, and the red zone extended far to the north. Red zones were so dangerous that small Minutemen units would not venture into them. Trying to control an insurgency was not something that he had experience with, and he found himself puzzled as to how to proceed effectively, as the militia leaders had used different tactics. The Minutemen scouts collaborating with Commonwealth intelligence agents were sent into the countryside to try and identify the source of all of these attacks. Hollis also worked out an arrangement with the Brotherhood of Steel. Certain individuals suspected of having ties to the militias were arrested and then airlifted by Brotherhood vertibirds to the capital wasteland to be interrogated by Circle of Steel agents. However, none of these efforts brought meaningful results. The militiamen were just too good at using the forests and mountains to hide their presence. A system of identity papers was instituted to control movement around the New Hampshire region. This caused the locals to resent the Minutemen presence more and more. Hollis had to rely on the counsel of Captain Chase as to how to deal with these attacks. Chase, seeing an opportunity to get rid of the other militiamen factions, counseled against direct negotiations, and instead advocated a strong response to eradicate anyone attacking them. To that end, he convinced Hollis to allow him to arm some of the newly arrived settlers, to form a militia group in the cities to counter the rebels. The new militia would be called the Patriot Volunteers. Chase convinced the volunteers that if the militiamen won the war, that they may lose their land and have to move back to the Commonwealth with nothing to show for their hard work. The Patriot Volunteers used their newly acquired weapons and authority to go out into the countryside and harass farmers suspected of having ties to the militiamen. Sometimes crops and houses were burned in the middle of the night. Sometimes families were massacred. The militiamen reciprocated these horrors in the new settler farms. Fights and riots took place in several of the towns between the original settlers and newcomers, with the Minutemen stuck in the middle trying to keep order. Out in the countryside, the volunteers and the militiamen took turns inflicting atrocities on one another. Chase used his 15th Minutemen and the Patriots to round up suspected militiamen and aggressively question them. He also confiscated homes and farms of those suspected to help the militias. He would then resell them to new settlers and keep the profits. Although the levels of violence were not extreme, neither side would gain an advantage over the other, and it soon would become apparent that something would have to happen. Back in the Commonwealth, the conflict as it was known was beginning to lose support as November arrived. Troops had been mobilized since late February, and the only ones returning were wounded Minutemen. Anti-war protesters such as the Cambridge Seven and the Minutemen Mothers Alliance began to attract more followers as questions about the occupation were being raised in newspapers as well as in Congress. The addition to dissatisfaction over the way that the war was being conducted, a series of scandals were coming to light. The rendition of prisoners to Brotherhood prisons, Captain Chase's land deals were questioned as he was profiting substantially from selling confiscated farms. Lexum factory officials had been secretly selling ammunition to third parties that might be linked to the militias, meaning that ammunition produced in Boston was being fired at Minutemen on the field. During a press briefing given to introduce the new Quebec ambassador, Piper Wright brought up several of these issues to an embarrassed President Hancock. She was promptly removed by security and arrested. The public outcry over this made President Hancock rescind the arrest. What nobody in the Commonwealth realized, not even investigative reporters like Piper Wright, was that the Lexum factory was still sending ammunition to the front, and that the central ammunition warehouses were still empty. At the Minutemen's supply depot, a stack of condolence telegrams covered the unsent purchase order on Major Finney's desk. His overworked replacement, Lieutenant Driscoll, was in New Hampshire trying his best to keep all the deployed units stocked with food and ammunition, but no one realized the warehouses lay empty. This dreadful oversight would soon come to be the greatest mistake in Commonwealth history. By late November, Leonard Webster had surpassed his strength before the Minutemen had arrived. Several displaced farmers and fishermen that had lost their homes during and after the invasion joined his cause. In addition, those militiamen that had left Joshua Chase at the beginning of the invasion found their way to him. Webster could now count on almost 500 militiamen. Webster had formulated a complicated plan of attack, one that he hoped would destabilize the Minutemen hold on the territory and force the other militias to fall under his command. As he did not expect help from the other militia forces, he did not share details of the plan with them. First, a quarter of his forces would launch attacks on the urban centers of Portsmouth and Concord. This, he hoped, would pull Minutemen troops into the cities to deal with the attacks. Once they were committed, he would take his main force and attack an isolated Minutemen base. He reasoned that if he could destroy this base, that this would prove that he was the most fit to command all the militiamen forces. It might even force the Commonwealth to withdraw from New Hampshire entirely. Webster decided to launch his attacks at Christmas time, as he expected that the Minutemen would be at their most vulnerable then. The civilian intelligence agency had an idea that something was going to happen. The agency received dozens of pieces of information on a daily basis. They had no direct information about the attacks, but their analysis concluded that something would happen towards the end of the year. They informed Colonel Hollis and advised that he take defensive steps. Hollis warned his captains to take precautions. However, Captain Chase dismissed these reports as he believed that the militias would not dare to directly strike at the Minutemen. As the end of December neared, Colonel Hollis restricted troops to their bases and began more aggressive scout and vertibird patrols, trying to figure out where the attack was going to hit. In the cities, the locals were celebrating the holidays. Captain Chase allowed many of his patriot volunteers to go home or to celebrate. Early on Christmas morning, explosions rocked Portsmouth and Concord as militiamen attacked key Patriot checkpoints in the cities. Fighting took place in Portsmouth as militiamen tried to take over the docks and to sink Navy ships in port. Concord was split in half as the militiamen took both bridges spanning the Merrimack River. Militiamen had lists of prominent Patriots and Commonwealth supporters in both cities. They went around executing those that they could catch. Chase was nearly captured in the first few hours. Hollis mobilized the 2nd, 13th, 15th, and armored companies to enter the Concord and clear out the militia. In Portsmouth, the Marines fought a holding action, waiting for the 7th and 14th to relieve them. The 5th, 6th, and 9th companies in Vermont holed up inside the cities expecting attacks from the other militias. The 3rd Company fought to the north at Camp Goodhue, prepared for a siege. Minutemen troops tried to enter the cities but found heavy fire coming from the buildings and houses. President Hancock specifically forbade Hollis from using artillery within the cities. This complicated matters, as Minutemen had to enter every building and try to distinguish between civilians, Patriot volunteers, and militiamen. Friendly fire incidents became quite common. Militiamen used the confusion to ambush Minutemen on the streets and then hide among the civilian population. Rooftops and tall buildings made ideal nests for snipers from both sides as they fired on anything that moved in the open streets. Scout snipers and militia snipers fought long-distance duels on rooftops for days on end. Militiamen used the sewers and basements to move back and forth. They brought in and distributed supplies using the sewers. They even surprised and attacked advancing Minutemen units. The Minutemen eventually learned this trick and extremely brutal fights took place underground. Far to the north of Concord, the 3rd Minutemen Company was held to reserve at Camp Goodhue on the shores of Winnipesaukee. The 3rd had been the unit that had crushed Webster's militia at the First Battle of Manchester, and the temptation to avenge his fallen troopers was too great for Webster to resist. Webster launched his attack on early New Year's Eve and pinned the Minutemen against the lake shore with no hope of retreat. The base would have to withstand a siege while the cities to the south were cleared. Neither Elijah Allen nor Matt Vanderberg moved to help Webster. Allen saw this attack as a desperation tactic with no point and no real hope of succeeding. Vandenberg saw it as an opportunity to damage the power of the Minutemen and a potential rival. He increased his attacks on the sector, but otherwise did nothing else. As the artillery was not to be used in city fighting, they were shipped north via rail lines to provide artillery support to the base. Webster, however, had anticipated this and had wrecked and blocked the rail lines north of Concord. The 2nd Pioneers had to be brought in from the Commonwealth to fix the rails. In the meantime, the 8th Air Lance was sent in to resupply Camp Goodhue and provide whatever possible air support. The defenders of Camp Goodhue dug in for the siege as Webster's militiamen made repeated nightly attacks on the camp's perimeter. As an experienced unit, the 3rd Minutemen did not break or panic at the thought of being cut off. With the vertibirds providing supplies, they continued to hold. By the beginning of February, the last militiamen had been cleared from Portsmouth. The focus then turned to Concord. Minutemen companies were moved to surround Concord from all sides and cut off the militiamen from resupply. The siege of Concord began in late February as power armor infantry moved in from the east and began clearing out buildings one by one. A ceasefire was brokered to allow civilians and wounded militiamen to be evacuated, but it fell apart after a few days. By mid-March, 1 year after the Minutemen had entered New Hampshire, the eastern part of Concord was back in Commonwealth control. President Hancock was persuaded to allow limited artillery barrages and vertibird strikes on western Concord. In late March, the 8th Air Lance had 2 tragedies. First, a vertibird taking off from Camp Goodhue clipped a tree and went down, bursting into flames. A week later, a second vertibird, performing a strafing run on downtown Concord, was hit by a rocket launcher fired from a tall building. The losses cost the Commonwealth half their air power. Eventually, both wrecks were recovered and were sent back to the Commonwealth, but it would be over a year before the first vertibird was functional again. By mid-April, the militia forces in West Concord were out of food and ammunition. The siege had finally broken the militia defenses on West Concord. Patriot volunteers advanced into West Concord, sometimes executing militiamen prisoners on the spot, until the Minutemen stopped them. Large numbers of civilians were incarcerated at the camps with no charges filed. Captain Chase was accused of several crimes, including murder. Reporters embedded with the troops wrote about these abuses in their newspapers. Support for the war dropped even further, with mass protests breaking out all around Boston. Even papers that normally supported the invasion wrote scathing editorials condemning the siege of Concord. Citizens demanded that the government do something about these excesses. President Hancock ordered marshals to take Captain Chase into custody. Although some volunteers objected, Chase was arrested and transported to Boston to stand trial for murder. Chase would plead guilty and ask the court to assign him to the 13th Minutemen. However, on his way to join the company, he was able to escape his captors and disappeared. Some claim that he went west and joined the Ronto pirates. Others say that he fell prey to a wandering group of supermutants. Whatever the truth, he was never seen in the Commonwealth ever again. Colonel Hollis took direct command of the 15th Minutemen and the volunteers. Hollis began to mobilize the Minutemen to break the siege at Camp Goodhue. The reports of the casualties in Concord disturbed most of the inhabitants of New Hampshire and Vermont. Even Matt Vandenberg, who was usually unmoved, was shocked at the level of violence. Elijah Allen knew that once the Minutemen finished with Webster that they would enter Vermont and grind his forces next. He asked Vandenberg to shelter his family and other non-combatants in northern Vermont as he prepared to face the Minutemen. Vandenberg readily agreed. Meanwhile, the 2nd, 7th, 13th, and 15th Minutemen approached from the rear to envelop Webster's militia. Now it was the militia that was surrounded. By early May, Hollis had his troops in place to break the siege at Camp Goodhue. Hollis coordinated with Captain Sullivan at Camp Goodhue. Minutemen scouts went ahead of the army and marked militia positions for artillery strikes. As soon as the artillery hit, the 3rd Minutemen began to push from Camp Goodhue to engage the militia forces. Webster transmitted an urgent plea to the other militias to come to his aid, but nobody answered the call. Minutemen artillery pounded the militia camp for 3 days straight. Webster could not believe that he was losing to the Minutemen once again. He pleaded for a ceasefire, and then had a subordinate take his life before the Minutemen arrived. Less than 100 militiamen went into captivity. With the destruction of Webster's militia, the balance of power shifted in favor of the Commonwealth. Northern New Hampshire had been cleared, and all that remained was to clear out Vermont. By mid-May, Hollis was back in Concord and planning a campaign to finish the resistance. Starting from southern Vermont and slowly sweeping his way north to drive out and finally crush all militia resistance once and for all. In his headquarters near Montemayor, Vandenberg realized that the time to fight had finally arrived. The Concord battles had damaged the Minutemen as he had hoped, but it was not enough. Desperate measures would be necessary, as he would need to command all the militiamen if he were to win this battle. He radioed Elijah Allen and informed him that his family and all the dependents were now hostages, subject to his mercy. If Allen accepted Vandenberg as leader, then they would live. He gave Allen a day to reply. Allen knew that Vandenberg was not bluffing. Vandenberg was many things, but he never made idle threats. He would execute the hostages. Left with little choice, Allen made the call. He contacted Colonel Hollis in exchange for rescuing his family and the other non-combatants. He and his militia would lay down arms. Hollis agreed to this arrangement, but changed the terms slightly. He asked Allen to assume command of the 15th Minutemen and all the militia forces in New Hampshire. Allen agreed to this. On the night of the 24th of May, a platoon of Minutemen scouts were airlifted to Jeffersonville, Vermont, a small town at the base of Mount Stansfield. There they attacked a Vermont Guard base containing the hostages and neutralized all of the guards. Vertibird swooped in and whisked away the hostages to safety, while the scouts' force marched their way to Burlington, Vermont. Allen's family was returned to him, and true to his word, Allen and his militia lay down arms and surrendered. Some of his militia joined him to fight against Vandenberg, but most just wanted to stop fighting and return to their farms. With the Rutland militia dissolved, only the northern part of Vermont remained as a hive of resistance in the territory. Hollis took his time and moved his units into place all throughout the month of June. He planned to squeeze the area until he could force Vandenberg into open battle. He would definitely crush the Vermont Guard. As he prepared to launch the assault, urgent word came from the Commonwealth. An invasion had erupted from the glowing sea. Thousands of super mutants were crushing the southern settlements. Preston Garvey and his units were the only forces protecting the Commonwealth. Worse yet, the ammunition warehouses were empty. Hollis had the only ammunition available in the entire Minuteman military. The plans for the assault were immediately dropped, as all the Minutemen hurriedly packed train cars full of ammunition and sent them south along with the artillery. The 2nd, 3rd, 9th Assault and Scout companies immediately departed for the Commonwealth. The 6th, 8th, 13th, and 14th companies stayed behind to support the 15th and the Patriot Volunteers to subdue the Vermont Guard. Over the next few months, the glowing sea crisis worsened, and the 6th, 8th, 13th, and 14th Minutemen were withdrawn to support the war. Without the other companies, the 15th Minutemen and the Patriot Volunteers were effectively stalemated by the Vermont Guard. After the Glowing Sea War, there was little appetite or political will within the Commonwealth for more intense campaigns. Scout platoons were sometimes sent into the region, but low-level violence continued to plague the territory for years to come. In 2301, Matt Vandenberg was meeting some of his lieutenants in the small lake town of Barton, Vermont. An unidentified man approached him. Eyewitnesses said the two men argued about a debt that Vandenberg owed. The man suddenly pulled out a pistol and shot Vandenberg in the chest. The man immediately fled as Vandenberg bled to death. Some claimed that the man was sent by Allen or the Commonwealth, but nothing could ever be proven. Neither was the body of Vandenberg positively identified. This led to rumors that Vandenberg still lived. The Vermont Guard continued on, but without Vandenberg's leadership it lost much of its energy. The region was eventually declared pacified by 2305. The Patriot Volunteers were disbanded, and martial law was lifted. Statehood was granted in July of that year. The expansion of the Commonwealth into New Hampshire has been a sobering experience. No longer was the Commonwealth hungry for expansion as it had once been. The reckless entrance of the Commonwealth into a region it barely understood had proven disastrous, as had the power of businesses to affect government decisions, and the ability of the president to set foreign policy. Massive reforms were implemented after the Glowing Sea crisis. Decisions on expansion would be carefully studied and debated before any action was taken. The next few decades would see the measured but steady growth of the Commonwealth, as the government focused on improving the lives of their citizens and not just expanding. The foundation period of the Commonwealth had come to an end. The growth of the Commonwealth was now at hand.